I want to tell you a fable that is from medieval Persia. It's called The Scorpion and the Turtle. You may have heard the Russian version of the frog and the scorpion. In this story, a turtle is about to cross a river. And a scorpion says, "Will you carry me across the river? I need to get to the other side." The turtle says, "Why would I do that? I know you're a scorpion, and I know what you do is sting and kill." The scorpion says, "Why would I do that? If I'm on you over the river and I sting you, you will sink and we will both die." The turtle says, "There is some logic to that. All right, hop on board." And so the scorpion hops on the turtle shell. But as they are crossing the river, the scorpion indeed tries to sting the turtle. As it works out, it hits the turtle shell and does not do harm. But the turtle says, "Why did you do that? Why try to stab me at the risk of your own life?" The scorpion says, "What am I to do? It is simply my nature. It is what I am. I am a scorpion who stings at any cost." And in one version of the story, the turtle simply tips his shell and drops the scorpion in the river to drown and makes his way across the river. Now, I tell you this analogy because we can ask the question, is the current Middle East full of scorpions? Or are there any turtles out there? Are all of the parties involved simply lashing out even at risk of their own destruction? Or are there some out there who are able to handle those types who lash out and who strike and who sting and learn? If the Middle East is simply scorpion versus scorpion, then everyone will drown. I want to give you a peek behind the curtain of rabbinic planning. There's always a popular rabbinic sermon theme out there. It's called, "Is it good for the Jews?" No matter what the event is, you can turn it to, "Is it good for the Jews?" But in recent years, this question has become more complicated because it may depend on which Jews where. When some events happen, we can ask, is it good for the Jews in Israel? And it might not be the same as is it good for the Jews everywhere. Often our interests between Israel and outside of Israel overlap, but sometimes they conflict. For example, evangelical Christians in America are staunch supporters of Israel, even a greater Israel, including the West Bank. But their vision of a Christian nationalism in America is a royal pain in our neck, and likely to get worse, to be honest. So having a war to destroy Iran's ballistic missiles and its nuclear program, and to undermine support for its proxy armies like Hezbollah and Hamas, well, that kind of a war would be good for Israel. All three of those threats, the ballistic missiles and the nuclear program and the proxy armies, they would likely destroy Israel if they could, as Hamas tried on October 7th. And destroying Israel would be bad for all Jews. Now, an American open-ended involvement in an active Middle East conflict that cannot be solved by bombing alone, well, that's bad for America, and it's probably bad for American Jews. Guess who America firsters on the right and anti-colonialists on the left are going to blame if there's a Persian Gulf boondoggle? It's going to be the Jews, and not just Israel. Some Jewish Israelis think that making life miserable for West Bank Palestinians through intimidation and violence will enable what they call, quote, voluntary migration and eventually annexation of the West Bank by Israel. But these settlers' pogroms and thuggery are terrible. They're terrible for human suffering, first and foremost. But they're terrible for Israel's global image. They're terrible for encouraging Jewish support for Israel. The whole debate over whether you're Zionist or anti-Zionist hinges on what you mean by Zionism. Because if Zionism means what's happening in the West Bank, then vast numbers would not support it. And just as important, I think these pogroms and thuggery are terrible for the moral character and cohesion of the world's one Jewish state and its armed forces. The more this happens and the more the police and army allow it to happen, the more corrupted the Israeli soul becomes. Now, I am not a geopolitical analyst. I am not a military strategist. I am not a pundit on American politics, and I'm not really going to talk politics today, although we can in discussion if you want. A thorough review of the current events in the Middle East in 20 minutes is impossible, so I'm not even going to try. Rather, I want to focus on 4 areas to give you a quick snapshot of where we are now. And for each area, I'll ask those 2 questions. Has it been good for Israel? And has it been good for the Jews everywhere? Our 4 areas will be Iran, Lebanon, Gaza and the West Bank, and Israel itself. Well, where are we with Iran? We're at the point in the Iran war where words are losing their meaning. For example, the word war. Not declared, not authorized, and people are trying to avoid using the word because it brings up connotations of either total mobilization or a long, long struggle. What does the word blockade mean anymore when both sides are blockading the same place? How does that work? The phrase regime change doesn't mean anything anymore because if you can have one Ayatollah replaced by his own son as the next Ayatollah, how is that regime change? What does an expiring ceasefire mean when it gets extended for no reason forever? And it may be that one of the ways out of this boondoggle will be to redefine what victory means. Maybe victory just means going back to the status quo ante, but you call it victory and you can leave. Part of our challenge has been that there's the fog of war. Nobody really knows how effective the initial attacks by Israel and the United States have been in inflicting damage on the Iranian military and their nuclear program potential. Even how much missile capability they have left is up for debate. How many ballistic missiles are left? How many launchers? Do they have the naval capacity to disrupt shipping? Well, has the war with Iran been good for Israel? It certainly has led to a strong decline in what they used to call the circle of fire, this ring of antagonists sponsored by Iran that would surround Israel and plan to destroy it. That has been really broken over the last 2+ years. And there's certainly been a decline in Iranian capability of inflicting damage on Israel, although by using drones and other shorter range munitions, they have inflicted quite a bit of damage on other Gulf states in the area closer to Iran. And yet, despite those missile interceptions that Israel has become so amazingly proficient at, there still were missiles that got through or debris that fell, and cluster bombs have proven particularly dangerous because even if you hit it in the air, the bomblets break off and fall everywhere and can blow up and kill people as they have. And there's also been tremendous social disruption with alerts all night long, night after night. More importantly, Iran's attacks on other Gulf states have had a paradoxical result. Their goal was to inflict pain on the Gulf states to get them angry at Israel and the United States. If anything, it's pushed them more inclined to talk to Israel and to come to some kind of a military or economic agreement. So, ironically, Iran might have done the wrong thing and pushed them toward Israel. Ultimately, our challenge in this debate with Israel and Iran is that the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, which is the IRGC that runs the military in Iran, they are pretty much a scorpion because they will sting, even if it hurts them, even if they are damaged or their people are killed. After all, they themselves killed thousands of their people earlier this year. Now, is the Iran war good for Jews everywhere? Well, certainly in America, resentment of the costs involved in this military expedition, or whatever you call it, and the priorities of America first versus another war in the Middle East, that will lead to challenges for Jews here. The casualties of Iranian civilians make it harder to justify. And if there is an invasion, boots on the ground, so to speak, there will be blood on the ground too. And American military casualties will be a source of resentment and anger tends to look for someone to blame. After all, we've already heard stories spreading that Netanyahu convinced Trump to attack and made his way into the Situation Room, and maybe there's a Jewish conspiracy behind the whole thing. That's out there. Those ideas are out there. And we know that there are tangible threats to Jews globally from both Iranian cells themselves and sympathizers. We've seen a rash of arson attacks against synagogues in the United Kingdom, as just one example. So how will the Iran situation end? Will there be successful negotiations this next round? Will it lead to renewed fighting for a short time, for a long time? Who knows? We just don't know. I know that Israel would be inclined to fight some more because they see Iran as an existential threat. I see that the United States seems reluctant to do so because they don't see they made much of a difference the first time around. I don't know what's going to give here and what's going next. I have to say, of these four areas, I'm actually most hopeful about Lebanon, which is the next. Where are we with Lebanon? Well, we're at a ceasefire, but a ceasefire between whom? There is a ceasefire between Israel and the Lebanese army, or Lebanon as a whole. They're not bombing in Beirut anymore. But between Israel and Hezbollah, there's still rockets, and they're still firing back. Air raids and artillery shelling happening in both directions. Hezbollah is the preeminent scorpion. They did not need to get involved this round. In March, when Iran was being bombed, they could have kept silent and Lebanon would have been silent. But because they rocketed into northern Israel, Israel has rocketed back. They claim the right, Israel does, even during a ceasefire, for preemptive strikes, for planned attacks. It's almost like pre-crime, where they're predicting when the crime will happen and then bombing before it does. There are peace talks going on in Washington, D.C. as we speak. But between whom? Well, it's between the Lebanese government and Israel. But the people who are fighting are Hezbollah and Israel, not the Lebanese government. Hezbollah itself has threatened the prime minister of Lebanon with death if he makes an agreement with Israel. We now have a buffer zone. You might have remembered from 1985 to 2000, there was a security zone that Israel maintained in southern Lebanon. It was a security strip, they called it. It basically was trying to keep Hezbollah away from the southern part of Lebanon south of the Litani River. It was to protect the northern communities of Israel from rockets, but of course it exposed the soldiers in that security zone to regular attacks, as has been happening in the last weeks. Of course, the other problem is Hezbollah is not just relying on anti-tank rockets that have to be short range. They now have longer rockets, even a few missiles that they can launch from much further north in Beirut or even further north in the Bekaa Valley. And so stopping the rockets locally or giving them a target in Lebanon of soldiers and bases is not solving the situation. Now, is the situation in Lebanon good for Israel? Israel's number one goal in Lebanon after October 7th of 2023 was to prevent an invasion of northern Israel by Hezbollah as it happened by Hamas out of Gaza. And so that's what they went in to clean out and to clear out. But the problem is once you set up a buffer zone and you say they're not allowed back and we are going to be sure they don't come back, is that there's no exit. And you have ongoing military strife and casualties. In the year 2000, I remember the then Prime Minister Ehud Barak deciding enough is enough. And he simply unilaterally pulled out to the UN agreed upon border. Hezbollah claimed there was one corner they weren't pulled out from and it was a source of contention and that was an excuse to keep fighting and keep shooting rockets into northern Israel. But from Israel's point of view, they had pulled out to the border because enough was enough and keeping a border zone wasn't keeping them safer. And now we're back into a border zone and security zone. Now, it was a surprise to Israel after the pasting that Hezbollah took in 2025 with the pager explosions and the killing of Nasrallah, who was their intellectual and spiritual head. It was a shock to Israel to see how many rockets and how many missiles Hezbollah had rebuilt in the limited time since the end of that conflict and the beginning of this one. And it just reinforces my belief, at least, that you need a political resolution, because if the military experiment or attempt becomes a whack-a-mole where there's just more moles popping up, then you need some other approach that's going to resolve it. in the end, if Israel can empower the Lebanese government to resist Hezbollah, to disarm Hezbollah, to domesticate Hezbollah, if possible, and if the Lebanese government will even try because it's a dangerous proposition, that would be the resolution that might stick. But if there is support for international border resolution and a real buffer peace force, whether it's the Lebanese army itself or a foreign force, that could be the breakthrough that leads to quiet on the northern front for Israel. Now, what about the Lebanese conflict and the Jews around the world? Is it good for them? You may recall that there was an attack on a synagogue in Michigan just recently, a few weeks ago. Temple Israel in West Bloomfield, which I've been to personally many times, was attacked by a vehicle that crashed into the building trying to attack a preschool of some 100 students and other teachers and staff in the building. The person who committed this crime and ultimately killed himself was a relative of two Hezbollah officers who had been killed. Now, I have to say, I shouldn't have to say, but I have to say, that acknowledging the fact that he had two relatives that died at the hands of Israel and then attacked a temple Israel, that's anti-Semitism. To assume that these preschool kids have any role or any culpability for what the Israeli military chooses to do is assuming that all Jews are one, and if they kill one of mine, I'm going to kill one of theirs. It's terrible thinking. But I'm explaining the context of what happened. I'm not excusing the actions that he did. And there's a risk of copycats with the same thought process. Just recently, this past week, a woman from North Carolina was arrested who had been planning an attack on a Houston synagogue with a car. The defeat of Hezbollah would be good for Jews everywhere. And it would be good for Lebanon too, because Hezbollah is the scorpion that's stabbing itself, stabbing Lebanon itself by bringing them into these conflicts with Israel that then destroy other people, not just Hezbollah. Now, how does the Lebanese situation end? Well, here's where I have some cautious optimism for some positive progress. After all, there's a law on the books in Lebanon that says it's illegal for Lebanese citizens to talk to Israelis. But now we have foreign ministers meeting in Washington, D.C. Maybe that's the beginning of a real productive dialogue. Now closer to the land of Israel, where are we with Gaza and the West Bank? Remember Gaza? It was in the news a lot. This is where the current crisis period started in October of 2023. But after the last hostage release, it seems to have fallen off the radar. There's a kind of a ceasefire with occasional shooting here and there, some Hamas attacks in Israel, some Israel shelling that they claim is targeting Hamas attackers. But Israel remains in control of over half of the territory of Gaza. But Hamas is controlling the vast majority of the population who are living on that northern half. And we know Hamas is definitely a scorpion because they took all that cement that was given to Gaza over the years and built bunkers and tunnels for themselves and not shelters for their own people, let alone positive construction projects for the good of the people of Gaza to build a future. They were willing to risk that future to destroy Israel, and in the end, they destroyed Gaza. The problem with Gaza right now is that no one is willing to pay for the costs of reconstruction without any kind of resolution to what happens to Hamas in Gaza. And this International Board of Peace and the local technocrats that were supposed to take over and manage the rebuilding, they can't even get started. Most of them haven't even moved into Gaza yet because there's no Hamas agreement on disarmament, which is a basic preliminary to moving forward. So Gaza is frozen, and the people in Gaza, having spent the winter freezing, are now suffering even more because it just continues. Even if there's more aid coming in, even if there's some medical care, living in tents forever is not tenable. Now what's happening in the West Bank? As I alluded to earlier, there are ongoing pogroms, these attacks on villages, on farms, on buildings, on cars. The claim by the Israeli government has been these are simply some disturbed teenagers and we need to give them some after-school activities to get them off the wrong path. But we know it's more than that. And we know that the police and the army in these territories are complicit in this. Some units that were set up as extra security for settlements after October 7th have been using their weapons and their uniforms to then attack the Palestinian civilian population. And the problem is that if the establishment accepts it, if the police doesn't enforce anything, if there's investigations that go nowhere, if there's no consequence for problematic actions, then what's to be done? The state is complicit. And in many ways, the radical settlers themselves are like the scorpion that continues to sting no matter who is harmed. We've also seen the government complicit in the expansion of settlements being legalized in the West Bank, including some settlements that were evacuated 20 years ago as hopefully a step forward to some kind of peace agreement. We are heading for a one-state solution from the river to the sea, but it's not the Palestinian vision of from the river to the sea being Arabic in the original Arabic version of that chant. The question instead is a Jewish hegemony from the river to the sea without rights for Palestinians. Will it be, if it's one state from the river to the sea, some kind of democracy, a multi-ethnic democracy? Or is it simply going to be apartheid 2.0 with a new model of dominance and submission? Can this one land share two national identities? Well, we have no proof that it can, unfortunately. Is this bad for Israel? Of course it's bad for Israel. We have a perpetual occupation of people who are not citizens, a democracy gap between what's promised and what's possible. The image of Israel in the world is horribly corrupted and diminished because of all the scenes coming out of Gaza and coming out of the West Bank too. You know, you can't win sympathy for your cause of being attacked by Hamas when people see what's happened since in Gaza. After all, Israel's trying to rebuild. They're calling this conflict the conflict of rebuilding. They're trying to rebuild their own Gaza border communities, but how can you do that when you don't know what's going to happen to Gaza itself? We've also seen the deep corruption of law and order. The more these people in the West Bank get away with it, and get away with it, and get away with it, the less people respect the law and order that Israel is trying to impose even on its own citizens. It's simply not going to work. And if your goal is to discourage BDS, boycott, divestment, and sanction, the worst thing you can do is to give those people more ammunition to say, look at what Israel is doing. It doesn't deserve defensive weapon. It doesn't deserve trade and commerce. Because look at what happens with anything they get. It goes into the West Bank settlements and into the oppression of other people. Just in Illinois, there's a debate right now happening in a committee in the state legislature to cancel the ban on BDS that was passed some years ago. Now, whatever your perspective is on BDS, if you're trying to think of what's good for Israel, BDS is not good for Israel. And those who would want what's good for Israel should be encouraging Israel to do better and give less ammunition to those who would withdraw from those connections. And ultimately, you're underlining the justice of the one Jewish state in the world. There's one Jewish state in the world. And if you want to justify it, it should have its own rights, but it also needs to do right by its neighbors and by the people living within it. And that hasn't been done. And in the end, if Israel is tearing itself apart over who's going to be drafted into the army, and they're having a limited military resource of person power, well, the more people you're deploying in the West Bank to protect these settlements, the less people you have to fight battles in Gaza or in Lebanon. And we know that what's happening in Gaza and the West Bank, and what has happened in Gaza and the West Bank, is definitely bad for Jews everywhere. Think about these protests outside of synagogues or on campuses, more attacks, more need for security. Even Kol Hadash has had to hire professional security to provide the confidence to our members to show up in person when we do hold those services. We've seen that Israel itself is being more and more disapproved of across the American political spectrum, by the way. If you ask young people of both the left and the right, Israel is much less in favor than it was even 10 years ago. And also, there's a kind of a moral rot that's happening in our connection to this Jewish state. If we support it, we feel inauthentic to our own democratic values. And yet, if we don't support it, we feel like we're betraying our Jewish solidarity with 6-7 million other Jews in the world. It's led to this harsh, bitter, dangerous Jewish communal division, where we're even fighting anti-Semitism, we can't find common ground. These are people that hate Jews, that want violence to Jews. And we're still blaming each other right and left, in part because we can't agree on what Israel has done and whether there's another path forward. Well, how does this one end? In Gaza and the West Bank? I'll be honest, I don't think it does. I tend to want to be an optimistic person. If I have a choice, I choose to be optimistic. But this current government has arsonists running the fire department. Now, would a new government be better? Well, that we're going to find out. And that's our last area to look at. What's next in Israel? There was an incident from Lebanon in the last 10 days or so that reflects this moral crisis that Israel faces. In occupying a Christian village in Lebanon, and keep in mind the Christians in Lebanon are the potential allies of the Israelis against Hezbollah, which is a Shiite Muslim party generally. So they had occupied a Christian village and they saw a Jesus statue in somebody's backyard. And so they took a sledgehammer, this soldier, and knocked it down and then was smashing it in the face. And someone took a picture and then they posted it on social media. Now, after 2.5 years of warfare, Israelis are feeling belligerent and angry. They're feeling intolerant of anybody else. And on some level, this incident demonstrates either cluelessness or carelessness about what the wider world thinks. If you think the entire world is against you, then who cares what they think about knocking down this statue? And so I'll take that picture. I'll post it on social media. Because there was the soldier who knocked it down, but there were other soldiers standing around who watched him. And one of them took a picture. And somebody posted it on social media. In fact, the Israeli Defense Force had to actually verify that this really happened, that it wasn't just AI, because it was so inconceivable. But that happens when you feel besieged, when you feel the world's against you, when you feel empowered to do whatever you want to the people you're conquering. When you treat the people you're conquering as if they're one mass and not one group opposed to you like Hezbollah and another group that might support you like the Maronite Christians. It's been the same response to peaceful human shields trying to protect Palestinian farmers and shepherds who themselves get beaten up. These are Israelis, these are American Jews who are simply trying to let people graze their animals in safety. And they get attacked. And of course, even worse for Palestinian civilians who have no protection when the army and police don't respond. Well, this is the mood among some in Israel, among many in Israel. There is an election for the Israeli parliament, for the Knesset, that is scheduled for this October, and it will happen. There are still very stark divisions between right and left in Israel, but it looks like the opposition might win. Their coalition strategy, I imagine, will be the same as the last time they won, which is, we are not Netanyahu. Of course, it's hard to find common ground when all you are is what you're not. And there's going to be people in that coalition that won't agree on many things. Netanyahu's side of the aisle is probably going to lose because of this boondoggle of draft rules, where the ultra-Orthodox yet again are trying to get out of being submitted to the draft, even as the Supreme Court has declared they must do some kind of national service. There's been no accounting, no ownership taken of the failures that led to October 7th and that disaster that killed some 1,200 Israelis in one fell swoop. And even the claim that Netanyahu is going to finish the job. Well, he said he was going to finish the job in Gaza, and after all that destruction and disaster, and Israel's image taking a beating, and Israeli soldiers' casualties, and the surrounding communities not being rebuilt, Hamas is still in Gaza. They were going to finish the job in Lebanon and take out Hezbollah, and Hezbollah is back, not as strong as before, but stronger than anybody expected them to be. So, by not finishing the job, maybe Netanyahu's job is finished. But what might happen this next election, as happened before, is that the linchpin to create a governing coalition may yet again be the Arab parties in Israel. Because to get over 60 seats, it might take one or more of those Arab parties to create a governing coalition. And that might change quite a bit. Even the last time, it changed the emphasis of the government on funding and in security and how it handled Arab, Palestinian, and Israeli Jewish issues. I don't know how much power that coalition will have, but if they've broken the seal the first time, being in a government the second time might be even more effective for that particular community. and ideally for both sides. One of the preeminent candidates for this election to become the new prime minister was a previous prime minister named Naftali Bennett, who himself came out of the Likud party. But Bennett recently made some comments against settler violence, and he himself has been a strong supporter of the settler movement. And he also made a comment in favor of civil marriage, tweaking the nose of the Orthodox who want to maintain their monopoly. So maybe he's tacking a bit toward the center. Now, I have to warn you, opinion surveys show that there is really no popular support for peace at this time. People are simply dubious that there could be any kind of peace agreement. By the way, Palestinians as well are dubious, given their experience over the last 2 years. There was a case, again, just this week that made the rounds on social media, where a man went to a cafe and he had on a kippah, a Jewish religious head covering, that had an Israeli flag on one side and a Palestinian flag on the other as a symbol of coexistence. And a man came and screamed at him in the cafe and said, what you're wearing is illegal, you're not allowed to wear that. And he said, it's my kippah, I'm happy to chat with you about it. The man said, I'm calling the police. And he called the police. And the police showed up and arrested the man for wearing this coexistence symbol. And he said, well, you've stolen my kippah. That's my personal property. I need it back. So someone in the police station took scissors, cut out the Palestinian flag, and gave him back the kippah with a hole in it from it being cut out. That's the ethos there these days. And so you're not going to get a coexistence platform getting large numbers of seats in this context of war and suffering. The options for the election are a re-election of Netanyahu, which is to continue getting worse along the same path, or maybe sort of pulling out of the dive. You're not necessarily going up, but you're not going down anymore, and maybe you find your way up a little bit later. I don't see any messiahs on the horizon. I don't see any magic solutions, but maybe it stops getting worse at some point. For all the debates that we've had recently over Zionism and anti-Zionism, criticizing Israel or defending Israel, what's good for the Jews in Israel versus what's good for Jews all over the world, whether we like it or not, we are connected. When the one state in the world with a Jewish star on its flag is hated, it's going to affect the people that wear a Jewish star on their necks, whether they're right-wing or left-wing, religious or secular. It'll even affect the people so secular they'd put a Jewish star tattoo on their ankle. With our history and our traumas in the past and in the present, in the dangerous neighborhood in which the Jewish people found its origins and in which half of our Jewish population lives, we need more turtles who can grow a thick shell and learn to deal with those scorpions out there who are going to keep trying to strike. In response, airstrikes and bombs might feel good for a moment, but ultimately, it will take people to change that pattern.